Welcome to the deep dive. I'm incredibly glad you're here with us today.
Absolutely.
Because if you are a military veteran, or maybe a soldier who went through basic training, or really someone who spent any time stationed at Fort McClellan in Alabama, I want you to know right up front, this specific deep dive has been custom tailored entirely for you.
It really has.
Today, our mission is to reconstruct the environment of that base. We're going to look at the visible landscape you probably remember, right? The red dirt, the barracks, the ranges.
The physical space.
Right. But more importantly, we're looking at the invisible environment that you likely knew absolutely nothing about. We want to decode exactly what you were up against, both seen and unseen, during your time in service.
And to do that properly, to really get into the weeds, we have brought a truly massive stack of documents to the table today.
It's a lot.
It's a staggering amount of paper. We are looking at declassified military environmental baseline surveys, heavily detailed site-specific safety and health plans.
The SSHPs.
Right, authored by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Plus, we have epidemiological assessments from the Department of Veterans Affairs alongside independent public health groups.
And we didn't stop there.
No, we also have historical records pulled directly from the Army Chemical Corps archives and issue briefs compiled by veterans advocacy groups. It is a dense, highly complicated paper trail spanning decades.
Yeah, looking at all of these pages, all these coordinates and tables of chemical properties, it feels completely overwhelming.
It is.
But that is exactly why we're here. Our goal today is to synthesize these complex, sometimes contradictory documents to separate rumor from the actual written record.
To find out what actually happened.
Exactly. We're going to examine the specific chemicals utilized on the base, the highly classified operations that historically took place right where you slept and trained.
The things happening right under people's noses.
Yeah. And the documented health effects of those substances. And finally, we'll look at the rigorous, heavily armored safety protocols that civilian contractors later used to clean up the very same dirt that you were crawling through.
And I think that contrast between those two realities, how the soldiers trained versus how the cleanup crews operated decades later, that's going to form a major spine of our discussion today.
It has to.
We really want to provide you with a comprehensive, completely impartial briefing on the historical facts of the installation so you have a complete picture of your own service history.
Okay, let's unpack this. Fort McClellan has an incredibly unique footprint in American military history.
It really does.
If we go back to the beginning, the base was established in 1917, right alongside the city of Anniston, Alabama.
Originally just for World War I.
Right. Initially, it was a mobilization and training site for infantry and artillery units gearing up for the trenches. But the true shift, the really dramatic evolution of this installation happened in 1951.
That's the turning point.
That is when it became the official home of the Army Chemical Corps.
And that transition in 1951, it fundamentally altered the DNA of the base. It was no longer just about conventional warfare, rifles, and artillery. Fort McClellan became the primary focal point for the United States Army's chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense training.
CBRN.
Exactly, CBRN. And to understand the scale of what happened here, we really have to look at the sheer demographics. Over 500,000 soldiers trained at Fort McClellan over its lifespan.
500,000 people, and a huge portion of those were women.
A massive portion.
Yeah.
Starting in 1952, Fort McClellan became the primary basic training base for the Women's Army Corps, or the WAC.
Right.
Approximately 350,000 female recruits trained there before the WAC was officially disbanded and integrated into the regular Army in the late 1970s.
That is a staggering number of people.
It is. And alongside the WACs, it was also the primary military police training base for the Army, Navy, and Marines. So we're talking about a constant, massive throughput of human personnel interacting with this specific environment every single day.
And what those personnel were training for was driven by a Cold War military doctrine that the sources repeatedly call, and I quote, readiness through realism.
Readiness through realism.
I want to pause on that phrase, because the military leadership at the time genuinely believed that the only way to prepare a soldier for the horrors of a non-conventional chemical battlefield was to expose them to real, lethal threats in a controlled environment.
And the absolute pinnacle of that doctrine was the Chemical Decontamination Training Facility,
The CDTF.
the CDTF, which began operating much later in the late 1980s. The sources note that this was the only facility of its kind in the free world at the time.
Wow.
Inside the CDTF, chemical soldiers actually worked with live, lethal nerve agents.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm reading this right.
Yeah.
They were using live nerve agents.
Specifically GB, which is sarin gas, and VX nerve agent.
These are some of the most lethal substances on the planet. How does the military justify that level of risk for a training exercise?
Well, the objective was ultimate confidence training. The military leadership reasoned that these chemical soldiers needed absolute, unshakable confidence in their protective gear.
Their masks and suits.
Right. And their decontamination techniques. The logic was, if a soldier has successfully decontaminated a live VX spill in a training environment and lived to tell the tale, they are not going to panic when the sirens go off on an actual battlefield.
I guess that makes a terrifying kind of sense.
It does. And according to the historical records, the training provided there did act as a formidable deterrent to the use of chemical warfare by Saddam Hussein during Operation Desert Storm.
Because our troops were so prepared.
Exactly. The CDTF operated for almost a decade and trained thousands of U.S. and allied soldiers with what the military cites as a flawless safety record.
A flawless safety record. But the documents make a very sharp, very important distinction here that we need to highlight.
Yes, they do.
That flawless record applies to a highly controlled, engineered indoor environment in the 1980s and 90s, complete with airlocks and industrial scrubbers.
The modern facility.
Right. But if we look at the decades prior, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the training wasn't happening in high-tech laboratories. It was happening out in the open air, in the dirt, across the broader base.
And that is the critical distinction for anyone who served prior to the CDTF era. The historical records show a massive influx of live chemical weapons into the open environment of the base during the early Cold War.
Out in the open.
Out in the open. For example, the archives document that in June of 1953, personnel from the Edgewood Arsenal explicitly escorted 50 4.2-inch mortar rounds filled with T-Boone directly to Fort McClellan.
T-Boone is the nerve agent GA, right?
Correct. And later that same month, mustard-filled bombs arrived from the Desert Chemical Depot in Tuel, Utah. These were not theoretical concepts in a field manual.
No.
These were physical, heavy munitions filled with highly lethal agents being transported right into the training areas.
Think about that if you were listening to this right now. If you went through standard basic training at McClellan or MP school, you might have assumed that the chemical threats you heard rumors about were strictly confined to specialized labs.
Locked away behind heavy steel doors.
Exactly. But the historical archival record shows that the perimeter of exposure, the actual physical movement of these weapons across the terrain, was so much wider than most people realized. The weapons were moving through the exact same environment you were jogging through.
They were sharing the geography.
They were, and that brings us to the operations that were entirely classified at the time.
Because that mandate for readiness through realism pushed the military to conduct highly classified human exposure testing.
Human testing.
Yes. The most prominent example in the records is Operation Top Hat, which took place in September 1953.
What was Operation Top Hat?
It was a secret project conducted under the auspices of the Chemical Corps School. The military essentially used their own Chemical Corps personnel to test decontamination methods against live sulfur mustard and live nerve agents.
So they didn't use mannequins or simulated animal tissue. They deliberately exposed their own personnel to see if their decon methods actually worked on human subjects in the field.
They were testing the real-world efficacy of protective garments and chemical decontaminants directly on soldiers. They needed tactical data on how long it took a unit to decontaminate a vehicle or a staging area after a genuine nerve agent strike.
And what happened to the men doing the scrubbing?
Precisely. While this provided the military with vital tactical data for Cold War planning, it resulted in long-term health concerns for the participants, which we will get into when we discuss the physiological effects.
We definitely will.
But the invisible threats weren't just chemical, they were also biological.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly a bit surreal to read about. The documents detail the biological warfare tests that occurred between July 16 and September 28, 1952.
A very specific window.
Yes. And during that window, a total of 21 specific open-air biological warfare tests were conducted at Fort McClellan.
We need to clarify what a biological test means in this specific context, though. The Army was not releasing lethal plagues like weaponized smallpox over the base.
Right, they utilized what are called biological simulants.
Simulants, yes. The goal was to study the dispersion, the drift, and the persistence of biological clouds.
Because they needed to know if a Soviet biological weapon is detonated over an American base or an Allied city, how does the cloud move through the street?
Exactly. How does it settle on brick buildings versus wooden structures? How long does it stay active in the soil?
And to figure that out without killing the local population, they used two primary microorganisms.
Right. The first is Serratia marcescens, which we will refer to as SM, and the second is Bacillus globigii, or BG.
Now, I saw these two bacteria mentioned in the 1952 files, the SM and BG. Why would the military go out of their way to use these specific strains for a wind test?
It really comes down to tracking and resilience. SM, the Serratia marcescens, naturally produces a very bright red pigment as it grows.
A red pigment.
Yes, so if you spray it into the air as an aerosol, it allows the military scientists to rapidly visually detect it in field samples. They could swab a building or a vehicle and literally see the red pigment.
Showing them exactly where the simulated biological weapon was settling.
Exactly. But the second one, BG, the Bacillus globigii, was chosen for a much more ominous reason.
Because it acts like anthrax.
That's it. BG forms incredibly resilient spores that perfectly mimic the environmental resilience of lethal anthrax, Bacillus anthracis.
And anthrax is famously difficult to eradicate once it gets into the soil.
It's nearly impossible.
Huh?
By tracking how BG spores survived in the dirt, on the pavement, and on surfaces of Fort McClellan over time, they were gathering direct, real-world proxy data on how an anthrax attack would behave and persist in an inhabited area.
And they didn't just spray this out in the deep woods of Pelham Range, far away from everyone.
No, they did not.
The archives pinpoint exactly where these biological clouds were released. 12 tests used the red pigmented SM, and 9 used the anthrax mimic BG.
Right in the main areas.
Yeah, the records state that on July 22, 1952, they used an area along 10th Street. And the main test target for the SM biological clouds included the buildings on 5th, 7th, 8th, and 9th Streets.
Right where people were living.
If you lived, worked, or slept on those streets during that era, the military was actively modeling biological warfare drift directly over your barracks.
And this specific open-air testing of bacillus spores has become a major point of contention today.
Understandably so.
Various veterans advocacy groups, specifically the McClellan Vets Group, point to this exact bacillus spraying as a direct match to the notorious Project 112 and Project Shad.
For those unfamiliar, those were a battery of deeply controversial military experiments conducted in the 1960s and 70s that tested chemical and biological weapons on military personnel and ships.
Without their informed consent.
Right, and we want to be very clear and impartial here as we are looking strictly at the sources on the table. We are not stating as a definitive fact that Fort McClellan was part of Project 112.
Because the official government documentation has not confirmed that link.
Exactly. What the sources tell us is that veterans groups have compiled environmental engineering papers strongly indicating that Fort McClellan was a remote test location for the biowarfare germ program operating out of Fort Detrick.
And these veterans are currently actively lobbying to obtain a new Government Accountability Office report, a GAO report, to officially confirm whether or not these spill sites and spray tests were formally part of the Project 112 experiments.
They are fighting for that official recognition.
They are. We are reporting the documented historical actions, the 21 open-air tests on those specific streets, and the ongoing administrative battle to classify those actions.
Right.
But if we move from the biological simulants back to the chemical reality of the base, the sheer inventory of agents physically stored, tested, and utilized at Fort McClellan over the decades is staggering.
It reads like a worst-case scenario inventory list.
It really does.
According to the environmental baseline surveys and the veterans' briefs, the arsenal on the base included mustard gas, tear gas, mace, white phosphorus, napalm B, Agent Orange, Agent Blue, CS riot control gas, fog oil, and hexachloroethane or HC smoke.
It is vital to break down what exposure to these specific families of chemicals actually does to the human body, because these are not abstract concepts for the people who served.
No, these are real medical realities.
Exactly. For the soldiers who trained there, these chemicals represent very real, long-term physiological consequences. If we start with the nerve agents like tabun, sarin, and VX, these function by inhibiting an enzyme in the body called acetylcholinesterase.
What happens when that enzyme is inhibited? What does that actually look like for a person?
Well, when acetylcholinesterase is blocked, Your nervous system essentially can't turn off its signals. It overloads and short circuits.
Ah.
The documented symptoms of exposure include excessive salivation, extreme tightness in the chest, making it hard to breathe, severe abdominal cramps, diarrhea, blurred vision, involuntary muscle tremors, and eventually total respiratory paralysis.
That is horrifying. And then you have the blister agents like sulfur mustard, commonly known as mustard gas.
A weapon dating back to the horrific trench warfare of World War I.
Right. The sources link exposure to mustard gas to chronic respiratory disease, repeated severe respiratory infections, and ultimately an increased risk of lung and respiratory cancers.
It's devastating to the tissue.
It doesn't just burn the skin. If inhaled, it essentially blisters and burns the respiratory tissues from the inside out.
And there is a specific documented anecdote in the archives from 1952 regarding a Private Robert Buckner.
Yes, I saw that.
He was officially admitted to the hospital at Fort McClellan for burns he suffered directly from mustard gas training. So this wasn't just a theoretical risk management scenario. Young men were actively being hospitalized for chemical burns.
Beyond the weapons of mass destruction, we must look at the defoliants.
The herbicides.
Right, the herbicides that were stored and heavily used on the base to clear brush from the firing ranges and training areas. We have Agent Blue and Agent Orange.
Let's start with Agent Blue.
Okay.
Agent Blue is an arsenic-based herbicide, and the clinical data links Agent Blue exposure to an increased risk of several severe cancers: bladder cancer, stomach cancer, lymphatic cancers, lung cancer, leukemia, skin cancers, and liver cancer.
Because arsenic is highly toxic and persists in the soil.
Extremely persistent.
And Agent Orange, which is so deeply tied to the Vietnam War experience, was also present at McClellan. The health impacts of Agent Orange are profound and well documented by the VA.
Yes, they are.
It's tied to the development of type 2 diabetes, Parkinsonism, which presents as Parkinson's disease-like tremors and motor issues, Hodgkin's disease, various lymphomas, leukemias, hyperthyroidism, early onset peripheral neuropathy, and prostate cancer.
It's a massive spectrum of disease. But we also need to critically discuss the substances that were considered entirely routine for training purposes.
The everyday stuff.
The things soldiers interacted with almost daily, like CS riot control gas and the smoke screens. The public health documents extensively note the use of fog oil and hexachloroethane, or HC, smoke.
These substances were used to create massive, disorienting smoke screens for infantry and armored training exercises.
Right. And critically, the sources note they were frequently used without the consistent use of protective gear.
Just breathing it in.
Just breathing it in. Fog oils that were utilized before 1986 contained potentially harmful, complex hydrocarbon ingredients. If inhaled in high amounts over time, exposure to these thick smokes poses significant chronic respiratory health risks.
This is a crucial connection to make for you, the listener. You might be thinking, well, I wasn't in the chemical corps, I was an MP, or I was just going through standard basic training.
I didn't handle sarin.
Right. But if you experienced those mandatory full-face exposures to CS riot control gas to get your military qualifications, where you had to take your mask off in the chamber and recite your name and social security number while your lungs burned.
Standard part of basic.
Exactly. Or if you were running maneuvers in the thick, oily haze of fog oil across Pelham Range, this is the physiological reality of what your respiratory system was processing.
The military was utilizing these substances across the board to create that readiness through realism for everyone, not just the specialists.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the chemical and biological elements, as staggering as they are, still only represent a portion of the story.
That's right.
Because Fort McClellan also had a highly sophisticated active radiological mission. From roughly 1955 to 1973, the base was heavily tasked with radiological defense training.
Yes, the radiological reality of right outfield. This is another area where the Cold War context is absolutely vital to understand what was happening.
The historical context is everything.
The threat of global nuclear annihilation was the dominant overriding fear of the era. The military desperately needed soldiers who understood the actual physics of nuclear fallout, radiation monitoring, and radioactive shielding.
You simply can't teach a soldier how to use a Geiger counter effectively using just a chalkboard and a textbook.
No.
They needed a massive practical training ground. And they built it at the Edwin R. Bradley Radiological Teaching Laboratories.
And this infrastructure was not simple.
Not at all.
It included a dedicated hot cell in Building 3192, complete with deep underground holding tanks specifically designed for storing radioactive material safely.
But the field exercises are what really stand out in the documentation. At areas designated as Old Rideout Field and New Rideout Field, soldiers were sent out to map simulated nuclear fallout patterns.
And to make those Geiger counters click, to make the training as real as possible, they didn't use electronic simulators.
They used live radioactive isotopes.
Live isotopes. The documents list the specific elements utilized out in the fields: cobalt-60, cesium-137, uranium, plutonium, and bromine-82.
The bromine-82, interestingly, was specifically noted as being used for Navy personnel who were practicing ship decontamination, washing down bulkheads after a simulated nuclear blast at sea.
The mechanics of how they conducted this training are really remarkable.
They utilized both locally fabricated and commercially produced radioactive sources, and they stored these highly radioactive sources in concrete subsurface wells out at Rideout Field.
In the ground.
In the ground. By mechanically manipulating these sources, literally raising and lowering them from the wells, the instructors could manually modulate the ambient radiation fields across the terrain.
They were essentially creating invisible, complex, geometric patterns of live radiation that the students had to detect and map out on foot.
So imagine being a young recruit, walking through the tall grass of an Alabama field, literally hunting for live cobalt-60 and cesium-137.
And the medical data on the health risks of exposure to these specific radioactive compounds is unequivocal.
It's very clear.
Exposure causes deep cellular damage, it can induce permanent changes to your genetic material, and it exponentially increases the risk of developing several aggressive forms of cancer over a lifetime.
Now, the military maintains in their reports that these radioactive compounds were handled mostly under strict, controlled conditions and in isolated locations.
Right.
But the fact remains that the very soil of Fort McClellan was being actively injected with live radioactive isotopes, alongside the nerve agents, biological simulants, and defoliants we've already discussed, all in the name of rigorous Cold War preparation.
But what is truly staggering is that everything we have talked about so far, the secret biological tests, the hot cells, the mustard gas, the fog oil that was all happening inside the fence line,
It was part of the mission.
it was the military's own doing, part of their operational mandate. But the environment outside the base was actively compounding the danger in a massive, uncontrolled way.
This is where we must introduce the toxicological concept of toxic synergy.
Toxic synergy.
From 1929 all the way to 1971, a massive commercial Monsanto chemical plant operated in the city of Anniston, located just south of Fort McClellan.
Right next door.
And for decades, this plant manufactured polychlorinated biphenyls, commonly known as PCBs.
The off-post Monsanto crisis. This is the wild card that makes Fort McClellan so entirely unique and so much more complicated compared to other contaminated military bases.
Let's define what PCBs actually are. They are a family of highly persistent organic pollutants. They were incredibly prized by mid-century industry because they do not break down easily and they heavily resist heat.
Making them absolutely perfect for use in electrical transformers, large capacitors, and heavy industrial lubricants.
Exactly. But that exact same chemical stability, the fact that they do not break down in nature, is what makes them devastating to the local environment and to the human body once they enter the food chain or the water supply.
And the plant wasn't just making a few barrels of this stuff, they were manufacturing it on an industrial scale.
A massive scale.
And according to the environmental records, releasing it directly into the air and the waterways of the surrounding community for decades.
And this brings us back to the concept of toxic synergy. If you look at a base like Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, which has gotten a lot of well-deserved national attention and legislation.
Right, the PAS-CT Act.
Their contamination issue was primarily driven by a single dominant contaminant in the drinking water supply, PCE, or trichloroethylene. It was a terrible tragedy, but from a medical research and epidemiological standpoint, it is somewhat linear to study.
It's one primary chemical.
Right. Fort McClellan, however, presents a uniquely complex, multi-layered toxicological profile.
A soldier stationed at McClellan wasn't just dealing with one bad well. They were potentially exposed to low-level nerve agents from the deacon training, plus background radiation from the Rideout Field fallout simulations, plus defoliants sprayed on the ranges.
And simultaneously, they were breathing in and absorbing off-post industrial PCBs drifting over from the Monsanto plant.
It is a chemical cocktail that makes traditional epidemiological study incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to untangle.
The physical reach of those airborne PCBs was incredible. The environmental studies cited in our sources found elevated PCB levels embedded in tree bark up to 3 miles away from the Monsanto plants.
3 miles.
That 3-mile radius covers significant, heavily utilized portions of the Fort McClellan installation. The wind literally blew the industrial pollution across the fence line.
The clinical health effects of PCB exposure are severe. The medical literature links PCB exposure to skin conditions like severe acne and rashes, specifically a condition called chloracne.
Which is very persistent.
Profound liver, stomach, and thyroid damage, suppression and lasting changes to the immune system, behavioral alterations, and heavily impaired reproduction. Furthermore, they are a known human carcinogen, specifically linked to aggressive cancer of the liver and biliary tract.
Consider the daily life of a soldier. You weren't confined to your barracks 24/7. The sources specifically note that soldiers were exposed during their off-duty hours.
Going into town.
Exactly. They had to use the public travel stations, the bus stops, and train stations in Anniston. They frequented the neighboring retail districts, the restaurants, the bars. They were immersed in the local civilian environment, an environment that we now know was heavily saturated with airborne and waterborne PCBs.
I want the listener to really think about that. You could have been the most diligent soldier on the base, following every single safety protocol to the letter.
Doing everything right.
Wearing your mask when told, washing your gear, doing everything right by the military standard, and be entirely unaware that the air blowing in from the neighboring town as you walked to the store carried a completely different, unclassified industrial threat.
The human cost of this toxic synergy is heartbreaking,
Mm-hmm.
and it is documented anecdotally in several of the sources we are reviewing.
The American Legion article really highlights this.
It highlights the generational aspect of this exposure, which is perhaps the most tragic element. They feature the story of a female veteran, a WAC recruit named Kiefer. She notes that no one in her family had previously experienced the health issues she is now seeing. One of her daughters suffers from unexplained chronic gastrointestinal problems. Another daughter, who she was actually pregnant with during her second stint stationed at Fort McClellan, suffers from periodic bouts of a severe ringworm-like rash.
And her husband has developed similar symptoms.
Exactly.
That detail about the WAC recruits is so vital. We have to take a moment to really acknowledge the gravity of this. Fort McClellan was the primary training ground for women in the Army for decades. Hundreds of thousands of young women passed through those gates.
A massive population.
And the researchers quoted in the American Legion piece, specifically David Carpenter, the director of the Institute for Health and the Environment, emphasized that the health consequences of these toxic exposures could deeply affect the children of these WAC veterans.
He explicitly states that something a grandmother was exposed to on that base can affect the grandchildren.
The concern is that these environmental exposures alter the reproductive systems and genetic material, meaning the WAC recruits were carrying these unclassified burdens long after they took off their uniforms and returned to civilian life.
It forces us to redefine what a casualty of this environment actually looks like. And this leads us to the eventual realization of just how contaminated the physical land truly was.
Fast forward to 1999.
Right. In 1999, Fort McClellan was officially closed under the Base Realignment and Closure Program, known as BRA. The goal was to transfer the property back to the public domain, primarily to the city of Anniston for economic redevelopment and the creation of wildlife refuges.
But before the military could legally hand the land over, environmental laws dictated they had to understand exactly what was in the ground.
And what they found when they finally looked was staggering.
The 2005 National Academy of Medicine report, which used to be known as the Institute of Medicine, officially recognized that both the groundwater and the soil at Fort McClellan were heavily contaminated.
They identified 67 distinct, separate disposal sites scattered across the base.
67 separate sites containing a terrifying alphabet soup of industrial and military waste, volatile organic compounds, trichloroethylene used for degreasing, the PCBs from Monsanto.
Semi-volatile organic compound.
Right, SVOCs, industrial pesticides, raw explosives, heavy metals like lead, radioactive sources, non-stockpile chemical materials, and widespread unexploded ordnance, or UXO.
This brings us to a document that I found to be one of the most eye-opening pieces of evidence in our entire stack.
The safety plan.
2002 Site-Specific Safety and Health Plan, or SSHP. This was prepared by the IT Corporation for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This massive document was written specifically to guide the civilian environmental crews who were brought in to investigate and sample just one tiny piece of the base, an area designated as Impact Area, Parcel 136QX.
Parcel 136QX is a 3.56-acre heavily wooded parcel in the northeastern portion of the main post. It was an old mortar firing range.
The level of detail in this safety plan is extraordinary, and it provides a perfect, almost cinematic contrast to how the military treated its own soldiers decades earlier.
The irony in these pages is almost painful to read. Think about an 18-year-old recruit in the 1960s or 70s, low crawling through the dirt of Pelham Range in a basic cotton fatigue uniform, sweating, breathing heavy, getting the red clay under their fingernails.
Just a standard day of training.
Now, contrast that memory with the extreme, almost science fiction level of precaution mandated for the civilian cleanup crews walking that exact same ground in 2002.
The action levels dictated by the 2002 SSHP are incredibly stringent. The site safety officers were required to continuously monitor the air using calibrated photoionization detectors, PIDs, to literally sniff for invisible organic vapors.
And they also used aerosol monitors to constantly check for dust, because the dust itself could carry lead or explosive residues right into the workers' lungs.
The rules they had to follow were rigid. If the air monitoring instruments detected volatile organic compounds at a sustained level of just 1 part per million, 1 ppm, above the background clean air in their breathing zone, the protocol was absolute.
Stop activities.
Stop activities. Suspend work. And if the reading sustained, they had to immediately evacuate the work area, notify the certified industrial hygienist, and upgrade their protective gear to what is called Level C PPE.
And Level C PPE is not just putting on a paper dust mask.
No, not at all.
According to the document, Level C required a National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health approved full-face air purifying respirator equipped with organic vapor and acid gas cartridges.
It required a hooded, sarin-coated Tyvek suit where the wrists and ankles are literally taped shut with chemical-resistant tape.
It required wearing 2 layers of gloves, inner latex gloves and outer nitrile gloves, plus neoprene steel-toed boots.
All of this just to take soil samples in a 3.5-acre patch of woods.
And it wasn't just the invisible chemical vapors they were terrified of the dirt itself. If the dust monitor read greater than 0.5 milligrams per cubic meter above background, they had to halt operations and initiate massive dust control measures, spraying water, just to stop the contaminated dirt from migrating on the wind.
The activity hazard analysis chart in this SSHP is 11 pages long.
11 pages just of hazards.
It lists the specific physical hazards these heavily armored cleanup crews were tracking. They were dealing with surface and subsurface unexploded 81mm mortars. They were finding rock-filled 55-gallon drums riddled with bullet holes.
They had to have dedicated UXO unexploded ordnance specialists walking ahead of them with magnetometers to clear a safe path before an environmental scientist could even step foot on a sampling site.
And alongside the mortars and the chemical vapors, the hazard analysis lists the mundane but deadly environmental threats of an Alabama summer. Extreme heat stroke from wearing the unbreathable Tyvek suits.
Venomous snakes, rattlesnakes, water moccasins, copperheads hiding in the brush.
And severe allergic reactions to poison ivy and oak.
It paints a vivid picture of a deeply hostile, thoroughly contaminated environment. The civilian contractors were legally mandated to treat the soil of Fort McClellan as if it were an active biohazard zone, employing the highest tiers of industrial hygiene and safety protocols.
Yet, this was the exact same soil that served as the daily living, sleeping, and training environment for hundreds of thousands of military personnel who were provided none of those protections, no respiratory monitoring, and no warnings about what they were breathing.
So, considering the Army Corps knew exactly how toxic this soil was in 2002 and wrote these massive safety protocols, how is the VA treating the veterans who actually slept in that dirt? We know it was there. The Army Corps of Engineers knows what was there. The National Academy of Medicine knows what was there. So what is the official stance of the government regarding the veterans who lived in it?
The current stance of the Department of Veterans Affairs is a masterclass in bureaucratic compartmentalization. On one hand, the VA Veterans Health Administration officially and publicly acknowledges the presence of these toxins.
They admit it on paper.
Their website concedes that service members at Fort McClellan were potentially exposed to radioactive compounds like cesium and cobalt. They acknowledge the use of chemical warfare agents, explicitly naming mustard gas and nerve agents, and they acknowledge the airborne PCBs from the off-post Monsanto plant.
Okay, so they admit the poisons were there and they admit the soldiers were there.
Yes, they acknowledge the geography and the chemistry.
Yeah.
However, the VA maintains a critical, legally binding caveat. They state that available data suggests that any exposures would have likely occurred at low levels.
Low levels.
Because the VA defines these historical exposures as universally low level, they draw a hard legal and medical line. Their official conclusion states, There are currently no adverse health conditions associated with service at Fort McClellan.
No adverse health conditions associated with service. That is a devastating, infuriating sentence to read if you are a veteran whose body is breaking down, suffering from early onset neuropathy or rare lymphoma.
It is the absolute crux of the impasse. Because the VA does not recognize any specific illnesses as being definitively caused by service at Fort McClellan, there is no presumption of service connection.
Let's clearly define that for the listener because it's the most vital piece of the bureaucratic puzzle. A presumption of service connection means that if you served at a specific place during a specific time and you develop a specific disease, the VA automatically assumes the military caused it.
You get your medical benefits and your disability compensation without having to fight a massive, expensive legal battle to prove exactly how you got sick.
Vietnam veterans have this presumption for certain diseases related to Agent Orange. Kaplasian Marines and their families have this for their contaminated water.
But Fort McClellan veterans do not have it. If a McClellan veteran develops liver cancer, they have to individually, on their own, prove that their specific exposure on the base decades ago directly caused that specific cancer, which, from a medical and legal standpoint, is practically impossible for a single citizen to do against the federal government.
And why is it impossible? Because the military didn't keep the receipts. We have the testimony of former Alabama Senator Howell Heflin, cited right here in the sources.
Yeah.
He testified before Congress that exact records were simply not kept.
The paper trail is gone or never existed.
The military did not record exactly where all the open-air testing of chemical weapons occurred on a day-to-day basis. They did not record the exact quantities of the chemicals used. They certainly did not record the wind levels or the weather patterns on the days they were testing to track the drift.
Without that exact granular data, creating a true, scientifically rigorous exposure map for any individual soldier is a fantasy. The VA says, show us the high-level exposure data, and the military says, we didn't write it down.
This systemic lack of data is why veterans groups, like the Disabled American Veterans and the McClellan Vets, are actively and aggressively lobbying Congress. They are not just asking for a handout. They are demanding legislation to authorize comprehensive, independent scientific studies of the environmental health impacts.
They want the epidemiological data to finally be funded and compiled so it can catch up to the historical reality of what happened on the ground.
And to add insult to injury regarding the Monsanto PCBs, in 2003, Monsanto Chemical settled a massive class action lawsuit with more than 200,000 residents of the city of Anniston for over $700 million because of the PCB contamination.
The civilians.
The civilians, the people living just outside the fence, got a settlement and recognition of the harm done to them. But military veterans who served at Fort McClellan, who breathed the exact same air and drank the exact same water, were uniquely excluded from that class action settlement.
They were excluded primarily because of their military status. There's a legal doctrine, often referred to as the Fair's Doctrine, that generally prevents service members from suing the government or government contractors for injuries sustained incident to their military service, leaving the VA system as their only legal recourse.
But as we just discussed, the VA formally denies the connection.
It leaves these veterans trapped in a jurisdictional and medical no man's land.
So what does this all mean? If you are a veteran listening to this, what does this deep dive mean for you? It means that your lived experience, the physical symptoms you feel, the illnesses your family might be dealing with, currently exists in a gray area of government recognition.
You are officially acknowledged as having been in a profoundly toxic environment, but you are currently denied the validation that the environment is what made you sick.
It means you are not crazy. You are part of an ongoing, active, and unresolved history.
It is a profound paradox that defines the Cold War legacy. The military required these soldiers to train in the most hazardous environments conceivable to ensure national survival. They demanded absolute readiness, yet the institutions they served are now relying on a lack of historical documentation to deny the long-term predictable consequences of that very same rigorous training.
We have covered so much ground today. We've reconstructed the invisible threats of Fort McClellan. We looked at the deliberate classified testing of live chemical weapons, nerve agents, and biological simulants like Operation Top Hat.
We mapped the radiological fields of cobalt and cesium out at Rideout Field.
And we overlaid all of that with the uncontrolled, massive off-base industrial pollution of PCBs blowing in from Monsanto. For the soldiers stationed there, whether you were an MP or a chemical corps specialist, it was an absolute perfect storm of toxic synergy.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, a concept that builds on everything we've discussed, but pushes the medical science into the future. We talked about readiness through realism and how toxins actively degrade the body. But modern genetic science is currently exploring a concept known as epigenetic memory.
Epigenetic memory. What exactly does that mean for a veteran?
We are learning that exposure to profound environmental toxins, like the persistent PCBs from aniston, or the complex hydrocarbons in the fog oil, or the low-level radiation at Rideout Field, doesn't just damage the individual's current cellular structure. These toxins have the capacity to leave chemical tags, known as epigenetic markers, directly on our DNA.
Altering the DNA itself.
And these tags alter how genes are expressed, turning certain functions on or off. The chilling part is that these markers can be passed down. They don't just affect the person who was exposed. They can manifest in their children and potentially their grandchildren.
So the damage doesn't stop when the soldier packs their duffel bag and leaves the base?
No. The true final casualty count of Fort McClellan's environmental legacy might not ultimately be found in the medical records of the veterans themselves. It might be hidden, waiting to be fully understood, in the genetic code of the generations that follow them. It means that the story of Fort McClellan didn't end when the gates closed and the land was handed over in 1999. It is actively living right now in the descendants of everyone who ever passed through it.
That is a heavy but incredibly important reality to consider. If you served at Fort McClellan, your history is still being written both in the halls of Congress and in the DNA of your family. We want to thank you warmly for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has armed you with the facts, the context, and the history of what you truly faced. Keep asking questions, keep pushing for answers, and please, keep sharing your own history. Until next time.